Okay. So let's start into getting into the specifics of how do you Swiss someone. Mm, And the first thing I want to talk about is, of course, the best thing in cedh and generally in life, no. But in cedh is if someone else does it for you. And that can happen in plenty of games. So the best thing is if your opponents Swiss each other or Swiss themselves. With Swissing, I will continue using this term of like blowing someone out. Like formally, you could define it as interacting with someone very efficiently so that they can't execute their game plans for multiple turns. So, but I will just use that definition. And if you are a good player, at least in European, you probably know the term because it is used very inflationary. Mm. So basically, what happens in a lot of games is that some people get blown out just from natural flow of the game. So, for example, a player mulligans very low, and then it's hard to come back for them. Or another thing is that a person loses their flip on the gamble, and then they have a very slow game plan. The third thing is someone tries a win attempt and gets stopped by another player. Another thing is someone loses their tally flip. And so I talked about Swissing all three opponents, but in practice you don't need to do that a lot because some opponent will Swiss themselves or Swiss each other. And less common examples is stacks pieces. So stacks pieces intend to hurt the opponents, but yuriko is very resilient to all sorts of stacks pieces. Like you can play through a lot of things very efficiently, and some people can't, and then they get blown out by the stacks piece. So, but then of course, like if people were all Swissing themselves, then you could play, I don't know, or Vadi all form, or choose any fringe deck that you want to hate on here. And you would still win. So, like, you can rely on your opponents. So, how do we Swiss them? So, we want to stop their game plan that they kept their hand for. And cedh decks and good players are designed to keep good hands that have a very efficient plan. And you can generally, how these plans work is that it's a spiral of mana into card draw, into mana, into card draw, into a win. Some decks like Kinnan or Grogthirst, they make a lot of mana and a lot of card draw before they attempt to win. And some decks like Roxai, they basically make a win immediately. I would count something like a Necro as a win and not as card draw because it is a win. I don't know. It's like a value Necro never existed. But you know what I mean. That some have a lot of mana, a lot of card draw. But what all of these decks have in common usually is that if you stop at some early node in the tree, which I guess is bad to explain like this, but if you stop them early enough, then usually they will not execute their plan very well. So let's talk about mana first. If you stop early mana development, then perhaps they will miss their land drop and never get to cast their card draw idea and never will get to perform their win. And sometimes for the rest of the game, that actually happens a lot. So, and the most powerful way to attack someone's mana is by no doubt this card, Null Rod. I've been surprisingly, I have to be a defender for this card because a lot of Yuriko players don't play it. And it's understandable why, because this card costs mana and it also hurts ourselves. You can see we play a lot of these artifacts. Hope of Gilbert just got cut. But we ourselves play mana, and it doesn't feel good to draw Lotus Petal after you played your Null Rod, or try to make mana with Prosperous Thief, or is a Ref in this deck? Can't remember what I put in my... or Ref. Like, we also use these very good mana artifacts to make mana, but that's why Neurot is so good, because these mana artifacts are so good that everyone plays them. And a lot of hands rely quite heavily on these mana artifacts to execute their game plan. So a common hand you see any blue deck keeping is something like land, land, tutor for Ristic Study, Lotus Petal. So when they try to do that, and you play before them in turn order and play a Neurot, suddenly their Lotus Petal does not work, and they sometimes do not have a turn to play because they relied on getting the turn to Ristic Study. And the consequences of Neurot are basically like can vary very greatly. Like I've seen games where Neurot, after getting played, an opponent who was very good and were very, very good opponents, they just did not cast a spell till the end of the game. And I've seen games where it didn't matter that much to them and they still developed and we still had a fight and they got to play Magic. But in general, this is the most powerful way to prevent mana from happening. So I will sometimes, if it has something else, keep a hand that's just like 3 lands, Imp Seal and something else, just to Imperial Seal 4 turn to Neurot and slam that turn to Neurot and watch my opponent cry in fear. So that's why it's a very good way to Swiss them. Like there's this new Ninja Donatello that can copy Neurots, maybe I'll play it at some point. So that's one way to attack the mana, but there's plenty of other ways. Another thing to attack the mana, which is of course always situation dependent, is misstepping the turn 1 Soaring. So that usually takes people out also because they rely on this mana. And again, many bad players misstep a turn 1 Soaring just because they think it's scary, and in practice it's not that scary. But you can misstep something like a Soaring or an early Esper, or I even misstepped a Birds of Paradise once, if your hand can afford it. Because if you understand this player is the biggest threat right now because the other player's mulliganed low or they play a slow deck that you have a good matchup against, then sometimes these early interaction points are what they don't calculate with, and also what sets them up back very far, because that's also what happens a lot, that people keep 2 lands, soloing and let's say Smothering Tithe, or what are good cards in this format. I don't play it anymore, no, I'm kidding. But then also you misstep their soloing and they don't draw their 3rd land, and suddenly they're completely out of the game just for one misstep, which if you misstep someone's win attempt on turn 4 and they're completely out of the game, they're not playing a very good deck. But if you are able to use some of these cards early, you can sometimes really blow them out. Then the other obvious part are mana creatures. These are also usually very hard to interact with, but not for this deck. We have, like, my favorite is 4th Witch Prowler, but you have a lot of removal like Orc Spurmasters, Member, Crippling Fear, Deadly Relic, Flare of Malice, Snuff Out, and I want to shout out Flare of Malice and Crippling Fear because they are board wipe, so they can kill a lot of mana, and what we come to later, also a lot of card advantage. And these effects that, like Flare of Malice or Neurot, that affect multiple people, or Curse Totem, are very powerful because you play one effect, you affect 3 people, and your rate in a 1v3 is just very good. Like, as we discussed, like a 1v1 trade is not very good in a 1v3, but if all your opponents are affected very badly by something, then the card becomes insane. It's like 3 time walks because you time walked all of your opponents. Or maybe that's not a good way to calculate it, but you get the point. So then, like, another notorious one is turn 1 Oppo. Sometimes your opponents then can't fetch, and then it also ends very badly. I had a game which I lost because I was really bad, but basically like 2 people fetched in response, and then I played an Oppo on them, and yeah, I don't know how I lost that game. That was pretty embarrassing. But still, Oppo is a good way to steal fetch targets, and also now getting into like transitioning that you how you beat their card advantage, it's also very good at stealing plans because like a lot of plans are like do an early tutor for your plan, whether that be heuristic study or necropotence or wall of roots if you're called Tyam, then playing an opposition agent can really hurt that plan and again time walk them. So then the other thing, of course, is that you can remove their card advantage, and here like card advantage in cEDH is pretty clearly defined what is good, what people play as card advantage. So you won't go into detail how to prevent someone from getting advantage by casting a divination or something, but there's like a couple big card advantage things. So the first one and the most annoying one is heuristic study. Heuristic study is one of the best cards to play against the yuriko deck if it's in this grind mode. As said, one of the advantages is that it has all these other modes and you can beat heuristic study by just winning. But like if your plan is to grind and someone plays heuristic study on the other side of the table, even like if they're top decked or something, usually you're not very happy. But okay, so this is, and maybe it gets banned, and Yuriko's gonna get a lot better. But whenever everyone knows what heuristic study does. And here's the thing though, heuristic study is so broken because in a high resource game state where everyone casts spells, it's really good. And the same goes for Mystic Removal, because in the high resource game states where everyone has a lot of cards and mana, it's generally the cEDH wisdom that usually the bottleneck is mana. So people will not, for a lot of Prisoner's Dilemma reason, which a lot of people talked about ad nauseum, not the card, but like very much. I won't go into detail, but like Heuristic Study will draw a ton of cards, your opponents draw a lot of game engines. So one way to remove Heuristic Study is to commandeer it, counter it, and sometimes, which is a card is in my considering board definitely, Steel Enchantmenting it. I think that's like once I get the meme Thoughtseize, which is also a Swiss card, Swissing card out of the deck, it's probably will get replaced by Steel Enchantment. One of the ways to beat Heuristic Study is Swissing your other two opponents so hard that Heuristic Study actually doesn't draw that many cards. So that's what sometimes happens in games, that you get to achieve that you screw the other two players' mana and then pay for the Heuristic Study. And then Heuristic Study is just a really good Sphere of Resistance. It's still a very great card, but an opponent who relied on just Heuristic Study to win them the game, which is a great plan usually, you can maybe Swiss them that way, that you make the other ones just like so unable to cast spells that they will not feed Heuristic Study enough, and you can run away with the game. And Mystic Mouse the same. And then the other way for people to get card advantage is creatures, and that's self-explanatory. You just kill the creatures and then they don't have card advantage, hooray. So whether that be for Tymna or Thracios, or that's the only good two I can think of. No, like let's say a Magda, or another thing that's common is that their entire plan of someone is the commander creature, and those decks actually have famously, or like I don't know, it's famous to like Yuriko players. They have a famously hard time against Yuriko players because you can basically keep like, you have so much removal that like a lot of hands that you keep are like land, 2 lands, an enabler, some stuff, and a removal spell, and just remove the opponent's creature, and then you remove it at some point after they like scramble to make back their commander. You kill it again, and they're so out of the game. That happened, for example, to a Joyer player I once played against. I just kept a normal hand that had also happened to have a Deadly Relic, and needed to Deadly Relic the Joyer. I did like a lot of mean things to him that game, but I think I killed it another time, and then I tapped his Mana Vault or something. And then he was just a bystander that interacted and sadly gave someone else the Wish Claw, so I didn't win that game. But a lot of commander-centric decks, especially with expensive commanders, and Arkham Dexon is another example, they rely on playing their commander. So killing the commander is a huge setback for them. while a card like Timna is usually a plan B, but sometimes people rely on their plan B, and sometimes people destroy themselves with their plan A or get their plan A destroyed and rely on a creature as their plan B. And if you can take that creature away like Timna, then you're in a very good spot and they are in a very bad spot. So the third way, of course, is to deny them their win. Like I said, a lot of people spy cards mana win. And some decks, some turbo decks, try to win very early. And then their hand is all in on the win. And if you, or also sometimes other opponents, if you play with blue players, then if they get their win con stopped, their hand is very bad. Like the classic example is the rock side. They kept their entire hand on hoping that a turn to ad nauseum would resolve, and you with your opponents fight to stop them. And then these players are basically just out of the game unless they draw another card that is good. And sometimes they don't have permanent mana sources. And sometimes they just don't draw the right cards. So they are out of the game for a large chunk of time and cannot use their turns effectively anymore to develop a lot of cards and snowball it into a lot of mana, which is exactly what we want, because in turns that your opponents can't use effectively, we get very ahead with our combat damage trigger with Yuriko, which is actually also one thing to point out about Yuriko, that it's one of the good things, that Yuriko is a combat damage trigger instead of something Italian that rewards opponents for casting spells. So Italian wants your opponent to have resources. Yuriko, every turn your opponents are struggling to make resources, you can just get ahead slowly by drawing more and more cards and dealing more and more damage to them. And another thing to point about Yuriko is, I guess, that you only have to attack one. So if your other people, if like all players are stonewalled except one, a Timna draws you one card, a Yuriko still draws you as many cards as you have ninjas. And of course, like, I will not go into details, but like you have ninjas that make this card draw very absurd, like Kaito and Genius Infiltrator or Roaming Thorn. So you get to draw a lot of cards. So stopping the wins is usually great, because A, they don't win, and B, you also will be able to have them Swissed and not be a part of a game. And as I didn't say that actually, but it should be pretty obvious by now, the less opponents you have, the better this deck is. And if one opponent takes themselves out of the game, they are a punching bag, so your Yuriko always gets through. And they also are not someone you have to Swiss anymore and don't have to fight. And another thing is that is also good to point out is generally your opponents will support Swissing another opponent. Like they talk you into it, of course, but that's not helpful. But they also will support you. So if you try to blow someone out, then they may chime in with a counter spell too. And you can maybe work with them together to kill something with the Bowmasters. Because in a vacuum, when one player just like gets Swissed really hard, the win percentage for every of the remaining players goes from the starting 25%, assuming all of them are equally good, to 33%. And then if you Swiss another player, you and your opponent have 50%. In practice, of course, one of the players will always have a better board state, but generally it's okay to keep in mind that you can work with an opponent that plays at least a sufficiently slow deck. You can work with them and try to Swiss out other players, and then basically through like the progress of the game and which cards you draw, you see which one of you two wins. But it's a very good outcome, because on average in these games you just have 50% win rate. So this is now like this is basically how you get to this famous or like I don't know the English word but known yuriko board states where like it's a very low resource slog fight where it's not a high resource game like most of cedh is. And now I will take another break and after that talk about how then you convert this great sloggy situation into 5 points on your leaderboard.